All right, we're in Daniel chapter 9. It's been a couple of weeks, so I want to review just a second and then jump into this last section of the 70 weeks. But so basically what has gone down, where we spent a couple of weeks, was looking at Daniel's prayer of confession for the people and their sins. And it showed us a great example of what confession should look like, and taking the responsibility for our sins. Then, as he's offering that prayer, in verse 20, the angel Gabriel is dispatched to him to talk to him about some things that are yet to come. And so we're going to read verses 24 to 27 and try and cover this section, which I know it's only a handful of verses, but this is the most difficult section in the whole book. Verse 24, 70 weeks are decreed about your people and your holy city, to finish the transgression, to put an end to sin, to atone for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal both vision and prophet, and to anoint a most holy place. Know therefore and understand that from the going out of the word to restore and build Jerusalem to the coming of an anointed one, a prince, there shall be 7 weeks. Then for 62 weeks it shall be built again, with squares and moat, but in a troubled time. After these 62 weeks, an anointed one shall be cut off, and shall have nothing. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Its end shall come with a flood, and to the end there shall be war. Desolations are decreed, and he shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week and for half a week, and he shall put an end to sacrifice and offering. And on the wing of abomination shall come one who makes desolate, until the decreed end is poured out on the desolator. All right. So I think a couple of weeks ago, we were able to just mention a few things, so we'll rehash them here very quickly. The first is this. Translations, ESV reads 70 weeks. Other translations, and I think the NIV was the one that carried it in the more literal sense. And that is, the Hebrew text literally just reads 77s. Okay? 77s, that's all it says. It doesn't say 70 weeks, it doesn't say 7 weeks of years, it just says 77s. All right? So you've got 2 whole big complete numbers. Now, the way it is commonly understood is that this is 70 weeks, but this is 70 times 7, 490, but those weeks are not 490 weeks, because all of those weeks stand for years. Okay? Yeah, if you look confused, you should be. Even though it's the most commonly viewed assumption about this text. I don't subscribe to that understanding. And the main reason I don't is because when I read it, there is nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, that gives me that notion. Okay? And I'm not talking about it's something that's viewed as 490 years, people outside of the church. I mean, it's the most predominant position inside of the church, that is 490 years. And it usually goes along the lines of a couple of things, but it begins to stretch it. And one of the things that I think we need to be concerned with is we are people who are chronologically driven as Americans. Clocks, dates, everything matters to us. That's the way we think of time. Jewish people didn't think of it that way, okay? And so the point that he's making here, 77s, you remember Jesus said in Matthew 18, Peter asked him, how often shall my brother sin against me and I forgive him? He says up to 7 times. And Jesus says, I don't say to you up to 7 times, but to 70 times 7, which is the same thing here, 490. Is Jesus being literal? No. He's using round figurative numbers to communicate an allotted amount of time. Okay? In this particular context, or in that context, a continuous nature of forgiveness. That's what he's trying to communicate. And so the notion of interpreting this for me, is troublesome. Now, I will tell you why I think some people, especially in our fellowship, are very concerned with nailing down in specific dates. And the reason why I think that is because so many people, and I think we may have mentioned this before, but William Miller is probably the most influential theologian you've never heard anything about. You see his work everywhere, but you don't know it's him. Okay? The most common group to him are Seventh-day Adventists. And their understanding of apocalyptic language and literature and end times. Dr. Ben Carson, who is a well-known figure in our nation, he's Seventh-day Adventist. Anyway, Miller and people in his way of thinking, which bleeds over into premillennialism, they want to predict end times and fulfillments. And so I think what a lot of us have this tendency to do is to say, well, I'll just show you how the numbers don't work for you and the numbers work for me. Instead of looking back and going, did God really intend for us to be sitting over here doing math? I mean, I know he's not opposed to it. I mean, I wish he were, but he's not. So I think the notion is that this is a set period of time. And when we read too much into what is going on, we just end up saying more than we know, saying more than we can prove. And look, I don't have a problem with anybody who thinks this is 490 years. I got a problem if somebody thinks it's 490 years and there's no other way to understand it. Okay? So, we're dealing with 77s. And in the text, okay, in verse 24, and I think we highlighted these a couple of weeks ago, you'll notice that there are these purpose-type statements made, each beginning with the word to, T-O. Okay, so we've got, I can't remember, 5 or 6 of them. To finish the transgression, to put an end to sin, to atone for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal both vision and prophet, and to anoint a most holy place. Those 6 things. And so whatever is being talked about here, these 6 things are somehow involved in them. Now, the way I'm going to go about presenting it to you is this. I think that there are, from my study, I think there are 2 views that make sense. Okay? 2. I'm going to give you both of them in sequential order. So we'll go through one and read the text with that understanding in mind. Okay? And then we'll take a step back and talk about the second one and read the text with that understanding in mind. I guess there's the possibility that there's a third way, and that is in a way where you kind of put these 2 things together. One is the actual prediction of the historical event, and one may foreshadow the future event. That's possible. Okay. So, 2 views. View 1. So we have spent a lot of time, and if you look in the context of what's been going on, so we saw the 4 beasts of 7. We saw the discussion in chapter 8 about the ram and the he-goat, about Medo-Persia and Greece. Okay? And in particular, about in the Greek Empire, there would be the division of the kingdom amongst the generals, and that there would be this individual, Antiochus, the 4th Epiphanes, who would cause all kinds of problems for the people of God in the mid to early 100s. Okay? And so, the first point of view says that this text is talking about Antiochus. Okay? So let's read it with kind of that understanding in mind. Okay? So in verse 25 it says, "Know therefore and understand that from the going out of the word to restore and build Jerusalem, to the coming of an anointed one, a prince, there shall be 7 weeks." Okay? Again, forget the numbers for a little while. Quit worrying about it. He's telling us the significance of the breaks, not telling us the significance of the numbers, just the breaks. So just pay attention to the breaks. And that's the key when we're studying a text that's difficult. Stick with what you know. Okay? Stick with what you know. So, from the going out of the word to restore and build Jerusalem, which takes place in Ezra chapter 1, when Cyrus sends forth word that they are to go forth and they can return home and rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. Okay? So, till his coming forth, to sending that word forth, to the coming of an anointed one, a prince. Okay, so anointed one. We would get, the word here is Messiah. It's the Old Testament Hebrew term. So, but here's the thing you have to keep in mind, okay? Messiah and Christ, one is Hebrew, one is Greek. They both mean the same thing. They just mean anointed one. They don't inherently, listen to this carefully, they don't inherently always refer to Jesus. Okay? Do you know in the whole book of Isaiah, all 66 chapters, the word Messiah, the Hebrew term Messiah, is only used once. And it's not a reference to Jesus. It's a reference to Cyrus in Isaiah 45. One time the word is used in all of Isaiah, and it has nothing to do with Jesus. It has to do with a Gentile king. So, we have to, when we're studying, we have to kind of set that notion aside and go back and really understand what messiahs or anointed ones were. And primarily in Jewish practices, messiahs or anointed ones were prophets, priests, or kings. Okay? Well, we know they never have a king again from Israel, so that's out. Okay? A prophet, they're going to have some more prophets, but there doesn't seem to be a significant prophet that would fit this role. So I think most likely the coming of the anointed one has reference to, probably in this view, this way of reading it, probably has reference to someone like in the book of Zechariah, in the book of Ezra, Joshua the son of Jehozadak the high priest. He's a very significant figure. In chapter 6 of Zechariah, he is pictured as the branch which is very much connected to Jesus. And so in this vein of reading and understanding, it would be the word goes out to restore Jerusalem. Joshua is involved in that process. His coming into his own, the prophecies that pertain to him, that will be 7 weeks. Okay? So then it says, then for 62 weeks it shall be built again, talking about the city of Jerusalem. It shall be built again with squares and moat, but in a troubled time. So the city of Jerusalem is built again. It's squares, talking about city squares, I think. So the city squares are built again, and moats, you know, and I don't think he even necessarily has a literal moat in mind. To my understanding, Jerusalem never had a moat around the city. Moats were for what? Protection. They're defensive purposes, right? And so what he's saying, I think what this may be a reference to is actually to the work of Nehemiah and the rebuilding of the walls. The protection returns to the city. So he says, the squares and the moats will be built, but in a troubled time. And when you read what happened, they constantly had trouble. The people of the land were giving them trouble. And then we hear the message of inspiration close, and then we start looking at intertestament history, and we see one problem after another, after another, after another, after another. So the temple is built again, but it's in a very troubled time. Okay, the people of God don't have rest. Then it says, verse 26, and after 62 weeks, an anointed one shall be cut off and shall have nothing. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Its end shall come with a flood, and to the end that there shall be war. Desolations are decreed. And he shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week and for half a week, and he shall put an end to sacrifice and offering. And on the wings of abomination shall come one who makes desolate until the decreed end is poured out on the desolator. Okay, so now we have an anointed one mentioned again. Now, in my opinion, and as both of these views persist, in my opinion, the anointed one, you have an anointed one in the verse before it and an anointed one here. They're two different people. They're not the same again, okay? So, the anointed one in this reading has to do, it's in a similar vein, it's in the high priesthood family, okay? So, in the high priesthood family, there is a priest that is assassinated, okay? And the prince who is to come, who destroys the city and the sanctuary, that would be a reference to Antiochus and how he comes in, and you see in verse 27, the abomination that makes desolate. That's a very common reference in Hebrew writing to when he brought a pig into the temple and offered it on the altar. Okay, that's sacrilege because it's an unclean animal, a Gentile bringing an unclean animal into the temple. So in their minds, he ruined the temple. Okay? So he destroyed it in that sense. And for 1 week and for half a week and put an end to sacrifice and offering. And so this 1 week then would be talking about a moment in his reign where it really intensified, where it became illegal to go to the temple. It became illegal to own a copy of Scripture. He burned all the copies of Scripture in Jerusalem. And then he makes this abominable offering upon the altar, and therefore kind of makes everything obsolete. Okay? Now, any questions about that? We got a couple more things we're going to do on it, but that's the gist. So the word goes forth to build Jerusalem to the coming of the anointed one. Joshua comes in, or perhaps some other prophets. And then from that point forward, the city is built, tumultuous time, and then there's a prince who is cut off, or there's an anointed one who is cut off, and the prince who cuts him off is Antiochus. And he creates all kind of sacrilege in the temple, shuts down the temple sacrificial system, the worship there, and everything along those lines. And so that's what some people believe Daniel is saying. Any questions on that? I'm trying to bullet point that as easily as I can. Okay. Now. Yeah. Mm-hmm. No, it would be, you're reading New King James, I'm guessing. So that would be a different rendering. What does it say again, word for word? Okay, so in that, it's still the same reading. This anointed one would be cut off, but not for himself. That is, his life is taken from him. He's assassinated. And, but not in some kind of a heroic or sacrificial way. He's just assassinated. The prince who is to come is Antiochus. And the corruption that he brings to the priesthood. That makes sense. Okay. By this view, I'm not saying that that's absolutely what Daniel's talking about. I'm saying by this view. Okay. It's a good question. Okay, so here are some things that we have to pay attention to. That translation looks like it makes pretty good sense to a degree. But you remember that he gave us some criteria that we needed to pay attention to. That he said the things in this vision that I'm showing you, it's supposed to accomplish these 6 things. Okay? So, to finish the transgression, which, depending upon how you interpret it, could be the transgression of Israel against the people of God, against God. To put an end to sin. For me, that's one of the hardest ones to explain in this view. I don't know how you explain how this put an end to sin. Okay? To atone for iniquity, that could be understood in the sense that the people of Israel are paying for their sins, for their rebellion against God. Okay, keep in mind, I'm not saying this is what it means. I'm telling you this is a way to understand it. And it is viable. Okay? To bring in everlasting righteousness, that is to make the people wholly dedicated to God. This is the way it would be interpreted. To seal both vision and prophet, that is to bring it to fulfillment. And to anoint a most holy place, that is another place of worship. Now, as you can see, it's got some strengths, it's got some weaknesses. In my opinion, it's not the strongest, but it's historically, I will say historically speaking, and we have not gone into history very much. Historically speaking, it is a very, very strong case. Textually, okay, which is what we're concerned with, it's a little bit harder, okay? Not the 25 through 27 part. Historically, we can see that and we can line some things up. But these two purpose statements, these 6 statements, that's where it gets harder to understand. How does it put an end to sin? But then that brings this question, how are you understanding the phrase, put an end to sin? Because when you hear that phrase, what's the first thought that comes to your mind, to put an end to sin? No more sin, all right? It wasn't a trick question. No more sin. All right, and people will say, and I just did a moment ago, well, how do you explain that away? How do you explain that with Antiochus? But then again, if in a way, there is a way you can argue that, people would say, well, Jesus makes more sense there. He put an end to sin. Yes. But in another way, no. Now before you call me a blasphemer, let me explain what I mean by that. It's 2 ways of looking at something. Depends on how you define putting an end to sin. Jesus dying on the cross did away with all the sin in the world. There's no sin that's still left. That's what I'm saying. It gets tricky. So, what is another possible way to read what he's saying when he says this vision is going to involve the putting to end of sin? What's that? To seal up. To fill up sins. Okay? Put it to its end. Okay? So if we're filling up a container, we fill it up to the very end till we can't fit anything in it. Okay? The end of sin. It can't go anywhere else. This is what holds it all. It can't go anywhere else. Okay? So, one of the points I want to illustrate here is when we're reading a text, there is one, we're almost always going to have an immediate reaction to how something sounds. And I'm not saying that immediate action will be wrong or right. I'm saying you need to explore more than just what is obvious to you. Okay? Because there are multiple ways and expressions. Okay? Communication and language is tricky, it's fluid. So, that's one understanding. The second understanding is the one that, in my mind, for years I have believed that's what it is, and I've never seen anything that overturns it. Okay? This, the first view, it makes some sense in my mind, but not as much sense as the other, okay? So, let's read it again. It says, "Know therefore and understand that from the going out of the word to restore and build Jerusalem to the coming of an anointed one, a prince, there shall be 7 weeks." Now again, the anointed one here would not be Jesus, okay? There's no way that fits chronologically, right? That would have to be further down the line. So, whoever this anointed one would be, some ruler, perhaps a political ruler, perhaps a religious ruler that helps lead the people of God, okay? Then for 62 weeks it shall be built again with squares and moat. That is the city of Jerusalem, but in a troubled time. That still fits. The intertestament period was a very troubled time, even on up to the times of Jesus, and even in the decades after Jesus. It was a very troubled time. And then it says, after the 62 weeks, an anointed one shall be cut off and shall have nothing. Now, the anointed one in this understanding would be Jesus. And the phrase cut off and having nothing would be pretty obvious, wouldn't it? He's cut off. Isaiah 53, he's cut off from the land of the living. Okay? He will have nothing. He was stripped down to nothing. He had nothing. He took nothing out of the world. I mean, he was down to everything. They were gambling for his clothes. So, and then it says, "And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary." So the people of the prince who is to come, this is dealing with, in this understanding, the Roman Empire, to destroy the city and the sanctuary being the temple. So that would put this then at talking about roughly the Jewish wars began in about AD 66 and spanned all the way through 70. A little bit more than that, but Jerusalem fell in 70. There was one last holdout in Masada, but that was it was a fringe. The war was over. Once the capital was gone, the nation itself was gone. And he said, "Its end shall come with flood. To the end there shall be war. Desolations are decreed. And he shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week and for half of the week, and he shall put an end to sacrifice and offering." Okay? So, when Rome destroys the temple, there's no rebuilding at this time. There was no rebuilding of it. Okay? So the sacrificial system is done. Okay? Matter of fact, to this day, there is one small sect, and I want to say it's a small sect of Samaritans, but I'm not certain about that. I want to say it's a small sect of Samaritans that they still do offer animal sacrifices. But when I say small sect, there's actually a website dedicated to them, and you can keep an up-to-the-moment track of how many of them are alive, and it's like 200 and something. Okay? So from that point forward, the sacrificial system has never been seen, heard, touched, done again. Because Jerusalem, you remember this all goes back to Deuteronomy chapter 12. God said, you can't offer a sacrifice just anywhere. You have to offer it in the place where I put my name. And Jerusalem was the place he put his name. And that's the way they've understood it. And so there has not been an attempt. And that's why in Judaism today, predominantly, save one or two outliers, there are no sacrifices. Okay? So that would make sense there. And on the wings of abominations shall come one who makes desolate until the decree end is poured out on the desolator. That is until the judgment comes on Rome itself, the nation that perpetrated this. So let's go back then and read this in 24 with these 6 statements and see. And I think this is where it makes the most sense. When it says to finish the transgression, didn't the Jews finish their transgressions when they crucified Jesus? I mean, that was the moment. Jesus says it in Matthew 23, the last of 23, when he says, you've always killed the prophets, and I'm next. And I'm the last one that will be sent to you. To put an end to sin. All right? Let me read something real quick. For then would he not suffer repeatedly since the foundation of the world? But as it is, he has appeared once for all at the end of ages to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. Hebrews 9:26. So that would make sense in Jesus. To atone for iniquity. Romans 3:25. Jesus is our atonement. To bring in everlasting righteousness. That is, Jesus brought in a way of living. A system of righteousness and a way of living that will continue on throughout the rest of time. Okay? To seal both vision and prophet, to fulfill it. Well, he did that. Matthew 5:17 through 20, he makes that very clear. I didn't come to destroy the law and the prophets. I came to fulfill them. Okay? So, and then to anoint a most holy place. Excuse me. The anointing of a most holy place, now this goes back into Hebrews, because the most holy place now is where? The temple, the tabernacle is now where? It's the church, and ultimately it's in heaven. Okay? What it symbolized the whole time. The temple and the tabernacle were just earthly, physical representations of realities of heaven. So this interpretation seems to make the most sense. Josephus, who lived through the besieging of the city of Jerusalem, he believed that that's what it had reference to in his book on the Antiquities of the Jews in Book 10, paragraph 276. He discusses it. I do find it interesting that there is... So there's a whole bunch of Jewish writings, and the most famous of them are called the Talmud. And the Babylonian, there are two different ones. One's the Jerusalem, one's the Babylonian one. The Babylonian one is the only one anybody really cares anything about. The Talmud, in its writings on this text, said that a curse should be on anyone who uses this text to predict the end of time. Pretty eerie, isn't it? Because that's what you're dealing with is the history of interpretation, and the reason why that is significant. So the history of interpretation is very, I think it's very important, I'll put it that way, to know how we come to believe certain things and how views come, how they become prevalent in our thinking, okay? And you can trace them and you can chart them and see who was the first person to actually pose this idea and how this person altered it and this person did this and it fell out of repute and then in this circumstance it came back. And this stuff is where you really start to understand how our world is religiously fractured, okay? And so in the history of interpretation, one of the things that I'm concerned about when we study the Bible in general, one of the rules we always try and follow is this. When I read, and it's not just even biblical text, it's texts in general. When I read a text that is not written to me specifically, I am to read it and understand it in the sense that the original recipient would have understood it. How the author intended it and how the recipient would have understood it. That's the way I'm supposed to read it. So, yes, it matters to me what Jewish people in the centuries that were very close to this prophecy, it matters to me how they understood it. They had a front row seat. They'd spent several hundred years studying it and watching it. I'm not saying it makes them right. I'm saying it's a voice you need to listen to. Okay? So, now, if this interpretation is right, that it's a reference to Jesus, and I think that is the right one, then what you see here makes this chapter even fuller. Because what has this chapter been about? Before you get here, what's this chapter been about? We've sinned. Israel has sinned. And Daniel is confessing his sins. And what is God saying at the end of it? Hey, we got it covered. We've got it covered. Jesus is coming. All these sins you're confessing, they're atoned for. That's the point. And so the message just becomes really, really full and meaningful when we see it in that way, and to know that God is telling this to Daniel, and Daniel probably has absolutely no idea what he's talking about. And that's not an insult to Daniel. I mean, I've got the full revelation in my hand, and I look at it cross-eyed half the time wondering what it's talking about. So, and the biblical writers in 1 Peter chapter 1 said that many of the prophets, they didn't understand what they wrote. They searched and inquired about what manner of time the Spirit of Christ that was in them was indicating, predicting beforehand the sufferings of Christ and the glories that should follow. They didn't understand fully what they were writing. They knew it was significant. They knew it was beyond them, but they didn't fully get it. And so Daniel didn't fully understand it then. I don't know that we fully understand it now, but I think we've got an idea of what it was going to. So we'll stop there and move into the last prophecy. We'll cover the last three chapters, 10, 11, and 12. And so we'll move there hopefully next week.